Most people make the biggest mistake in the garden right after they finish harvesting. They pull out the old plants, leave the soil bare, and think the job is done. I used to do exactly the same thing, and every spring I wondered why my vegetables looked weaker even though I added more compost and spent more money on fertilizer. The truth was sitting right in front of me, but I could not see it for years. Every time I left my soil uncovered through autumn and winter, I was quietly losing the richness that had taken the whole season to build. Rain carried nutrients away. Wind dried the surface. Weeds moved in before I even noticed them. The soil became harder every year, and I kept trying to fix it by buying things from the garden center instead of asking why the problem kept coming back. Then, an older gardener showed me something so simple that I almost laughed. He told me that the ground should never stay empty if I wanted it to stay alive. He was not talking about another crop to harvest. He was talking about cover crops. Some people call them green manure, but I simply think of them as helpers that work while I rest. At first I doubted that a handful of inexpensive seeds could do more than bags of expensive fertilizer, but after one season I stopped doubting. The soil became softer under my feet. Digging was easier. I saw more earthworms than I had seen in years, and my vegetables responded in a way that surprised even me. The best part was that these plants asked for almost nothing from me. They grew after the harvest when the garden would normally sit empty, and while I was enjoying quieter days, they were quietly feeding the ground for the next season. That is why today I want to show you exactly how I use cover crops after harvesting, when I sow them, why most gardeners accidentally waste their effort, and how one small decision in autumn can completely change the way your garden performs next spring. But before we get to the first simple step, there is one mistake that almost everyone makes with cover crops, and if you miss it, the whole idea loses most of its value. I remember the first year I truly paid attention to what happened after I stopped leaving my beds empty. Before that, I believed that bare soil meant clean soil, and I even felt proud when every plant had been removed and every bed looked neat. It took me a long time to understand that nature does not like empty ground. When the soil has nothing growing in it, the rain slowly washes valuable nutrients deeper than vegetable roots can easily reach. Strong winds dry the surface until it becomes hard like a crust. Then weeds arrive because nature always tries to cover open ground with something. Most gardeners notice these problems one at a time and never connect them together. They buy more fertilizer because the vegetables seem weaker. They water more because the soil dries faster. They spend hours pulling weeds because the empty beds invited them in during autumn and early spring. I made every one of those mistakes myself. Then an older friend asked me one simple question that stayed with me. Why are you feeding weeds instead of feeding your soil? That question completely changed the way I looked at my garden. Instead of thinking only about the vegetables I wanted to harvest, I started thinking about the ground that had to support every future harvest. That is where cover crops quietly do their best work. They protect the soil from heavy rain. Their roots keep the ground open instead of letting it become compacted. Some varieties even help collect nutrients that would otherwise disappear during winter. When those plants are later cut down and returned to the soil, they become food for earthworms and countless tiny living organisms that most people never even notice. This is not a complicated system, and it does not require expensive equipment. You simply let nature help instead of leaving the soil to struggle on its own. Very few people do this because there is no dramatic result after 1 week. The change happens little by little until one spring you notice that your shovel slides into the ground more easily and your vegetables seem stronger from the very beginning. That was the moment I realized I had been working much harder than necessary for many years. But choosing to plant a cover crop is only the beginning, because planting the wrong one at the wrong time is another mistake that many gardeners make without realizing it until the following season. Many years ago, an old farmer told me something I never forgot. He said that if you want the soil to feed your family next year, you have to feed the soil first. At that time, I smiled because I thought he was talking about compost or manure. Instead, he pointed to a field covered with simple green plants that nobody planned to harvest. It looked almost abandoned to me, but he told me that this field was working every single day, even though there were no vegetables growing there. That conversation stayed with me, and eventually I decided to try the same idea in one corner of my own garden. I did not expect much because the seeds were inexpensive and the work was simple. I scattered them over the empty bed after harvesting my tomatoes and lightly covered them with soil. Then I watered once and mostly left the area alone. A few weeks later, the bed was covered with fresh green growth while the rest of my empty garden looked dry and tired. Through autumn, those plants quietly built roots beneath the surface while protecting the soil above. That winter, heavy rains came several times and I noticed something interesting. The beds with no cover became packed and crusted while the covered beds stayed softer and easier to walk on. When spring arrived, I gently cut the cover crop before it produced mature seeds and left the green material on the surface for a short time before working part of it into the top layer of soil. I did not rush because most people make the mistake of burying fresh green plants too deeply or waiting until they become old and woody. Timing matters much more than force. The younger plants break down more easily and return their goodness to the soil much faster. Very few gardeners pay attention to this small detail, yet it can make the difference between helping the next crop and slowing it down. That first season I planted my vegetables exactly as I always had, and I quickly noticed that watering became easier because the soil held moisture longer. Digging no longer felt like pushing a shovel into hard ground. The roots spread more easily, and I found earthworms almost every time I planted something new. That was the moment I realized the old farmer had never been growing those green plants for themselves. He had been growing healthier soil. But the next question became even more important because not every cover crop does the same job, and choosing the right one can save you an entire season of disappointment. After I learned that lesson, the next question was simple. Which cover crop should I actually plant? I made the mistake that many beginners make and thought every green plant would do the same job. It does not work that way. Over the years, I discovered that matching the right cover crop to the right bed makes everything easier. If I had just harvested tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, or squash near the end of summer, I often reached for cereal rye because it grows well as the weather cools and quickly covers the soil before winter arrives. I was shown this many years ago by a gardener who never liked seeing bare ground even for a few weeks. He told me that every day the soil stayed covered was another day it stayed healthier. He was right. In other beds where I wanted to improve the soil naturally, I often chose crimson clover or another simple legume. These plants quietly work together with tiny organisms around their roots and help prepare the ground for future crops. You do not see this happening from above, but next season, you notice the difference when the vegetables begin growing with more strength. Very few gardeners give these plants enough credit because nothing exciting happens overnight. The real reward appears months later. Another old method that has served me well is mixing two different cover crops together instead of relying on only one. For example, I sometimes combine rye with clover. The rye quickly covers the surface and protects the soil from rainwind and weeds, while the clover quietly builds fertility below. They help each other without asking for much from me. This simple combination has saved me both time and money more than once. The biggest mistake happens when people wait too long before sowing. They finish harvesting and think they will plant a cover crop next weekend or after another small job. Then, colder weather arrives, the seeds struggle to establish, and the opportunity is gone. I try to sow mine within a few days after clearing the bed while the soil still holds warmth from summer. The seeds germinate quickly and build enough growth before winter slows everything down. It is a small habit, but it changes the result completely. The wonderful thing is that once the seeds are scattered and lightly covered, there is very little left to do except let nature continue the work. But there is another step that many people overlook in spring, and if you get that timing wrong, you can lose many of the benefits you spent the entire autumn creating. When spring finally begins to warm the garden, this is where I see many people lose part of the benefit they worked so hard to build. They become excited to plant vegetables again, and they either turn the cover crop into the soil too late or too early. I made both mistakes myself. One year, I let the plants grow until they became tall and tough because I thought more green growth would always mean better soil. Instead, those thick stems took much longer to break down, and my young vegetables struggled at the beginning. Another year, I removed the cover crop almost as soon as it started growing, and missed much of the work those roots could have done underground. After a few seasons, I found a much better balance. I cut the cover crop while it is still green and tender before it produces mature seeds. That is the moment when it is easiest for nature to recycle it back into the soil. Most gardeners make the mistake right here because they think they must dig everything deeply into the ground. I rarely do that anymore. I often cut the plants close to the surface and leave much of the green material on top for several days. Sometimes I lightly mix part of it into only the top layer of soil and leave the deeper layers undisturbed. This simple method protects the tiny life already living below the surface and keeps the soil structure much more open. Another small habit that has helped me for years is giving the bed a little time before planting vegetables. I do not rush. I usually wait 2 or 3 weeks after cutting the cover crop so the green material can begin breaking down naturally. That short waiting period often makes a noticeable difference. The soil becomes easier to work, and there is no thick layer of fresh plant material competing with young seedlings. Very few people have the patience to do this because everyone wants to start planting immediately after the first warm days arrive. I understand that feeling because I still get excited every spring, but the garden has taught me that waiting a little often saves much more time later. There is one more detail that many experienced gardeners quietly follow, and it costs almost nothing. It is not about buying better seeds or stronger fertilizer. It is about choosing the right vegetable to follow the cover crop, and once I understood that simple connection, my harvests became much more reliable year after year. After using cover crops for several seasons, I noticed something that no bag of fertilizer had ever given me. The garden became easier to manage instead of harder. I was spending less time fighting the soil and more time enjoying the growing season. That may not sound exciting at first, but if you have been gardening for many years, you know that saving time and effort is just as valuable as harvesting another basket of vegetables. I no longer had to break through hard ground every spring. Water stayed in the beds longer after a gentle rain. Even during warmer weeks, the soil remained cooler beneath the surface because it had been protected instead of left exposed for months. The vegetables seemed to settle in more quickly after planting, and I often found myself watering less than I had in previous years. It was not because I had discovered some miracle product. It was because the soil itself had become healthier little by little. One simple habit had quietly changed everything. Another thing I learned was to match the next crop to the work the cover crop had already done. If I had grown clover during autumn, I often followed it with vegetables that appreciated fertile soil. If I had used rye mainly to protect the ground and improve the soil structure, I planted crops that benefited from loose, well-prepared beds. This is one of those small details that very few people pay attention to, yet it makes the entire garden work together instead of each season starting from the beginning again. I also stopped worrying so much about chasing perfect results. Some years, the cover crop grew thick and beautiful. Other years, weather slowed it down. Either way, it was still protecting the soil far better than leaving it empty through autumn and winter. That gave me confidence because gardening has never been about perfection. It has always been about giving nature enough help to do what it already wants to do. Many people ask me whether cover crops are worth the effort in a small backyard garden. My answer is always the same. If you have enough space to grow vegetables, then you have enough space to improve the soil that grows them. You do not need large fields or expensive equipment. A small packet of seeds and a little patience are often enough. The real secret is consistency. You repeat this simple habit every year, and the improvements slowly build on each other until one season you realize your garden is producing more while asking less from you. And that is exactly why I never skip this step anymore, because the final lesson is not really about growing cover crops at all. It is about changing the way we think about the garden itself. Looking back now, I sometimes smile when I remember how much effort I used to spend trying to fix problems that I had unknowingly created myself. Every autumn, I thought the season was over as soon as the vegetables were harvested. Today, I see that moment very differently. For me, the next harvest begins the day the last tomatoes, peppers, or beans leave the garden. That is when I prepare the soil for another year instead of simply putting my tools away. Cover crops have become one of the easiest habits I have ever added to my gardening routine because they keep working while I do something else. During autumn, they protect the soil. During winter, their roots continue holding the ground together. In spring, they quietly return much of what they borrowed. None of this requires expensive machines, special products, or endless hours of work. It begins with a small packet of seeds and a simple decision not to leave the soil empty. I cannot promise that one season of growing cover crops will suddenly double every harvest, because gardening has always depended on weather patience and many small choices working together. What I can honestly tell you from my own experience is that healthy soil almost always rewards the gardener who takes care of it year after year. My garden has become softer, easier to dig, better at holding moisture, and far more pleasant to work in than it was years ago. I spend less money on products that promised quick results and more time enjoying the simple work of growing food. That may be the greatest reward of all. If you have never tried cover crops before, I encourage you to begin with just one bed this autumn. Do not worry about making everything perfect. Watch what happens through the seasons and compare that bed with the ones you leave bare. Nature is an honest teacher, and she will show you the difference better than I ever could. Once you see healthier soil beneath your feet and stronger vegetables growing above it, you will understand why so many experienced gardeners quietly follow this forgotten habit year after year. And in our next conversation, I want to show you another simple method that many older gardeners still use to keep moisture in the soil longer while reducing weeds without spending money on expensive materials. It is another small change that most people overlook, but once you see how it works, you may never garden the same way again.